Hey guys, Greg Benz here. In part 2 of this web sharpening tutorial, you'll learn how you can manually convert your layered TIFF file into a beautifully sharp JPEG for the web on your own. The purpose of this tutorial is really to show you what goes into making a great image for the web, not so much that you do it manually on your own, because using something like my web sharpening utility is going to give you a simple interface where you can quickly get everything done in one step and quite frankly get a better result. Behind this simple interface are a couple thousand lines of software code that can do much more complicated things than you and I can easily do manually on our own. So this is the approach that I would recommend, but we're not going to use that here. I want to show you how to do it manually so you just understand behind the scenes the core principles behind web sharpening. To begin with, this image is starting life in the Adobe RGB color space that I've been using to edit. Most browsers are not properly color managed unless you go and take control with advanced settings. And so if you just upload your images in Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB to the internet, a lot of times you're going to end up with muted colors or other problems. So we need to convert this to SRGB before we go and send it to the internet. And I want to show you the wrong way of doing it first so you understand that converting your layered image has a couple of problems. First of all, we don't want to convert our master file anyway because we might save over it. But secondly, things like these adjustment layers, these curves, have fixed RGB numbers. And if we convert to another color space, Photoshop does not have a way to convert these numbers in Adobe RGB to the corresponding numbers in sRGB, which are different numbers for the same color. The same numbers mean different things in these spaces. So when we convert the image, it will change how it looks if we're working with a layered file. Let me show you. So we're going to go up to Edit, Convert to Profile, and we're doing this on the layered image, which is incorrect, but we're going to choose sRGB and use black point compensation. The intent here, relative color metric, is generally speaking what you'd use, but it does not matter when you go to sRGB because it doesn't support other color modes. No matter what you choose here, Photoshop's just going to give you relative color metric. So click OK and watch the background and see how that got lighter there. And let's take a look at before and after. You can see there's a loss of contrast and a change in the overall appearance of the image. And the reason for that are these adjustment layers, which are messing things up. So we need to go back to the original. Let's start with our Adobe RGB image, and you'll see it catches up in just a second there. We're going to start with this image and do it the right way this time. So let's go to Image, Duplicate. So now we're going to kill two birds with one stone because we can merge to a single layer, and we're going to create a derivative copy so we don't save over the original. Click OK, and in just a moment we'll have a new image here, which is a single layer, and now we're ready to go where we can convert from Adobe RGB correctly by going up to Edit, Convert to Profile, same settings with sRGB, use black point compensation, click OK, and this time there's no change in the appearance. We've gotten to sRGB that we need, but you can see from before and after, this time there's no effect because we're working on the flattened version of the image. We're now ready to begin resizing and sharpening, and I just want to mention that what I'm going to show in this video is one way of sharpening. In the written version of this tutorial, I'm going to list a couple of other ways you can approach it. One of which is actually where you resize a little bit and then you sharpen and then you shrink it all the way down to the intended size, sharpen it some more. Some people prefer that method. I actually like the method I'm showing here. It's very simple. I find it produces a very good result without having too much crunchiness or problems in the image, but there are several ways you can go about it. So check out the written version to learn more. Let's go up now to Image, and we want image size. This is where we'll resize the image from the high resolution image down to the intended size. I want to send this as a square 1080 by 1080 image for Instagram. And so when I type this in, you notice that the width and height are not matching. They're staying proportional to the original size because I have this constrain option active here. If I turn it off, I could type in manually the same dimensions, but notice the preview is now looking stretched because if you turn off this constrain, you're going to get a warped look to the image. So you definitely want this on, and you need to put in the best match you can get here, which is not going to be 1080 for the width because the height is not big enough. Instead, put in whatever is the smaller one, make sure it fits. So now we have the proper 1080 height and the width is too big, but we'll just crop it out later. The important thing is that they're proportional so the image looks the same after it gets resized. The resolution, you can use any value you want here. It does not matter at all. Resample has to be checked or you wouldn't be able to change these numbers. And then in the method here, you could leave it at automatic. That's a great choice. Or you can just manually set it to something like bicubic sharper, which is labeled for reduction and is what most people are going to use for shrinking their image for the web. You could consider some other methods. For example, bicubic smoother can help avoid some rough, crispy edges. But generally speaking, I think bicubic sharpener is what most people are going to choose and should give great results. So use that and we'll click OK. And we now have our resized image, which we want to view at the proper scale for sharpening, which is 100%. We're at 16%. Hit Command 1. So we now have the 100% view of this image. And at this point, we're ready to sharpen. But before we do so, let's keep a copy of the unsharpened version, because if sharpening introduces any problems and we want to control it locally, we want to have this original version. So I'm going to rename this to not sharpened. Hit Command J to duplicate. And then I'm just going to rename this simply to sharpened. So we'll sharpen on this top layer. And then by putting a layer mask on it, we have the ability to paint it into just the areas that need to be sharpened. So make sure you click on the pixel, so that's what gets sharpened. And then I'm going to go up to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. Again, in the written version of this article, I describe a couple of other approaches you can take, but Unsharp Mask gives really nice results with a fairly simple interface. To use this, you have 3 different sliders. Set the amount up to something like 1 or 200% so you can at least see what's going on with the other sliders. Then you can dial in these sliders and come back and finalize the amount. The radius should be between about 0.5 and about 2.0. When you're at the higher values, you get kind of this crunchy or crispy look. When you're down at like 0.5, you're not seeing a difference here, but if you had sharpening halos at the edge of a building or something, this can help minimize that. But I would generally say 1 is a pretty good choice for most images, and I think it works great here. So I'm going to leave it at my recommended default of 1. Next up is the threshold, which is a little bit harder to conceptualize. What's going on here is you're saying unless you get more than a 5-level difference from one pixel to the next, do not sharpen. So this is a way of avoiding sharpening, which is a great way of avoiding sharpening noise. And the way this works is within like the detail of these buildings, you have big jumps in pixel values from one to the next. So there's definitely more than a 5-level change across these buildings, and they're going to get sharpened. But when you get up into areas like the sky here, you get all this smooth detail, and from one pixel to the next, there's very little change, and it probably is within a 5-level change. And if it is, it will not get sharpened, so you'll avoid that sharpening noise. So if you have noise in the image, which we don't here, you can grab this slider and drag it to the right to help mask it out. Generally speaking, I'd say stick within a 5 to 10 level threshold most of the time, but just know that this is a way you can control noise, or you can go and use the mask after we've done this. Either one is a good approach. The mask gives you more control, but this can be a more automated way of removing a little bit of that noise. So I'd say just use 5 unless you have a reason to use something else. Then the amount here, we can dial it in. We could go for a lot more sharpening, which I think looks too crunchy. We can try and go back towards like 100%, which looks good, but I think maybe closer to that 140, 150 range. I like the extra little bit of sharpness to this image here. So I'm going to stick with 143 here and click OK. At which point I have the sharp image above the unsharpened image. You can see just how much it's increased the detail in that image. I'm going to zoom in a couple layers here, or a couple levels, so that you can see on YouTube that there's been a big shift between these. And if you want to control the sharpening, we can click on this mask, hit B for our brush, and with a black brush, paint out areas where it should not be sharpened. You can see from before to after that I've changed the sharpening in just this local area by painting black on that mask. I'm going to exclude that. I'm just going to leave it with the original white mask because I think it looks great everywhere. But just know that if you had to remove noise from the sky or water, or you just somehow wanted different amounts of sharpening in different parts of the image, a mask with a sharpened layer above the not sharpened layer is a great way to give that local control. And at this point, we're really ready to crop it and save it. So let's go to the cropping tool. But first, I want to zoom back with Command minus so I can see the whole image clearly, and either hit C or click on the crop tool. We need to bring in the edges to get our 1080 by 1080 pixels, because remember, our width was something like 1600 pixels. Is too many pixels. We need to cut them out. And if we go up to the ratio, just type in your intended pixel dimensions and you'll get the exact correct ratio. So you can see this is the proper square ratio, and by default it's a centered crop. This is what you get if you were to crop within, say, Export As or Save for Web. And I don't want the centered crop. I want more of the left side of this image to show. So I'm going to click and drag to the left so we see something like that. I think is a better crop for this image. When you're happy with it, you can hit Enter or just click on the check mark. And now we have our cropped image, and we're ready to finally save this as a JPEG. If you're not worried about compression settings or metadata in the image, you can just go ahead and hit File, Save As, and go change it over to JPEG. Make sure you're embedding the color profile. Not terribly critical for sRGB because it's assumed, but I think it's a good idea and it adds almost nothing to the file size. And just click Save. Then you get a few options here. I would choose Baseline Standard if you're really being conservative, but Baseline Optimized is a little bit smaller file that is widely compatible across the internet. And then you can choose your quality, which should be something like 10 if you really want to push to maximum quality, and perhaps as little as like 6 if you want a little bit less. The challenge here is you don't really know exactly what kind of quality you're getting. So I'm just going to hit 6 and hit OK, and then I'll show you another way of approaching this. So instead of doing the Save As, there's a couple things we could do to clean this up further. First of all, I want to note that the metadata is still in this image. We had the original image and we duplicated it in a way that's going to preserve the metadata. If we go up to File, Info, you can see all my original camera settings, my camera serial number, GPS if I had it, keywords, rating, all this stuff is in this file. And if you don't want to share that kind of information, if it's sensitive and you want to strip it out before you go and share it with strangers on the internet, you can do so. Unfortunately, there's not an easy way to do it here. You can't go and just delete it from this interface, but what you can do is use the Export As or Save for Web options, which also let you interactively see the best JPEG compression. So you kind of deal with two problems at once here. So we'll go up to Edit, go to File, Export, and as I mentioned, there's Export As or Save for Web. If you're on the newest version of Photoshop CC 2020, then Export As is a great option because when you go in here, you have a nice simple interface. You also have this 2-up where you can compare one version of the image with different quality settings. You can go and change the quality and you get a comparison between the two to see how they look and see the resulting file size. But this is only going to give you the 2-up view in CC 2020. So I'm going to cancel out of this. And instead, let's look at the other one, which is File, Export, Save for Web. And this is something that goes back for years in Photoshop to at least CS6, where you have the same kind of control. The interface is a little bit more confusing. It's a little more cumbersome, but it does a great job. So what you want to do is choose 2-up. So you're comparing side by side. And on the left-hand side, by default, it's on the original. You can see there's no change in settings here. And when I click on the right, it's defaulted to the last thing I used, which was JPEG at a quality of 70. What I can do now is zoom in with Command plus or click on the little plus minus here and kind of zoom in and then move around. And let's go to take a look at these buildings and see how they compare. So the left-hand side is this original version, which obviously looks terrible at 800%. We don't really need to look quite so closely here, versus the compressed JPEG on the right. And I can see some differences already in the quality, but let's make it really obvious online here. If we drop the quality down to like 40%, see these little dots around the details here that don't exist in this version of the image. Or if you can't quite see that, I'll zoom back in. And now you see these little JPEG artifacts. If I push it even further, I got to click on the right-hand side, change my quality back down to like 20 or so. Now you're starting to see some really horrendous problems. And so what this is letting me do is compare what I get at different compression levels versus the uncompressed image before I save it. I can also see the file size here. So it's a 4.5 megabyte file versus a 210K file. So certainly 20 here is too low. I'm going to bring it up. Let's try back around 63 here. I definitely see some differences, but I'm looking way too close. 600% is not a realistic comparison. I should come back to 100 or 200% to compare that. And at 100%, I see no difference at all. At 200%, it's there, but it's just barely there. So at 100%, which is really the right evaluation, I think 63 looks great. You might choose a little higher if you're worried about that, say 70, whatever. Once you've set that, you have the same option in this save as a JPEG where it's progressive or optimized. I would choose the optimize. I leave the embedded color profile on, and otherwise you're pretty much good to go. You don't want to convert to sRGB. You don't need to since we've already done it, but you could choose it here as kind of a safety. The last choice that you want to take a look at is the metadata. So remember we had the camera serial number and other details about the image. Well, you can change it to say all, which would keep all that information it had, or you can leave it on, copyright or copyright and contact info, which is going to be your name and your website if you saved it in there, so that it strips out all that other sensitive metadata. So this is going to give us both a visual way of assessing the right compression settings and an ability to strip out the metadata if that's a concern for us. The rest of this you can ignore. We don't need to resize the image since we've already done it. And of course, you might be wondering, well, why not just use this to create the JPEG in the first place? But remember that there is no sharpening in this interface. And even if there was, you can't sharpen locally. And if you were to change the image size, then the way they had to crop the image, it'd be a centered crop. So there are a number of limitations in this interface. It's great for the final save to a JPEG for the metadata and the compression, but the rest of the stuff you should really do manually on your own. Once you've got it set the way you want, just go click save. And again, just point it where you want it to be. I could just call it, save for web to remind myself that that was a different version that I created. Click save, and I'm done. I can now close this. I no longer need this. If I'm worried about changing the masking on this or something later, I could save this TIFF to keep that option, but I really don't want to keep this image. I'm going to close it, and it's going to prompt me about saving changes, because when I save a JPEG, I'm not saving the layers. I'm just saving a flattened copy of the image. So it's just letting me know that I would lose some information. I'm just going to say don't save because I don't need that, and we're done. Hope you enjoyed that, guys. Please be sure to check out the other video and my free web sharpening utility, which you can get using the links below. And be sure to like and subscribe to be notified of the next tutorial.